Alberto never understood why people were afraid of the dark. Ever since he was a little boy, he'd welcomed the pitch black like an old friend. Whether the dark came of its own accord, like at the end of the day, or if he beckoned it with sleep, or booze, or drugs, it never failed to pull him into its open arms, wrapping him in black, silky oblivion. It offered protection, if only for a few hours, from the brutal realities laid bare by the rising sun. No, Alberto was not afraid of the dark, but the light scared the living shit out of him. And right now, the two seemed to be battling for control of his body. The daylight pulled him up briefly, just long enough for the pain to register. But then the tendrils of black unconsciousness coiled around his thoughts, pulling him back down into the deep end of oblivion. He realized he must be laying face down on the street. The thought was enough to make him open his eyes, which were immediately assaulted by the early morning sun. He was splayed across a storm drain, his left cheek wedged into a deep fissure that split the asphalt. Mierda, he murmured to himself. He pushed himself onto all fours, wincing and groaning in concert with his spasming muscles. Okay. Slowly, he lifted a hand to swipe at the tiny stones still embedded in his face. It felt good to be rid of them, but he felt the warm, wet tackiness of what could only be blood. Fat droplets of crimson splattered on the ground, disappearing against the tarry blackness. Alberto took a deep breath and, with every ounce of strength he could muster, straightened to his full 5 feet 10 inches. Around him were the backs of the faded, weather-beaten houses. It took a few seconds for him to place his whereabouts. He was at the end of the alley that ran behind his local dive bar, El Gallo Rojo, in the heart of Puerto Rico's La Perla. Only a stone's throw from the cobblestone streets and quaint shops of old San Juan, the Pearl loomed dull and bedraggled in comparison. Alberto pulled the filthy, sweat-drenched T-shirt off his back and held it against his head to stave the flow of blood. He tried to piece together the events leading up to waking up here. There were drinks, lots of drinks. There were always lots of drinks since Rosaria had died 7 months ago. The night that everything went terribly, terribly wrong. The night that Alberto became a widower with a toddler and an infant. His girls, his Isabelita and his Mariana. The instant her name sounded in his mind, an impulse shot through his alcohol and grief-addled brain. He wasn't prepared for the sudden, overwhelming sensation of all his synapses erupting at once, and he had to reach out, steadying himself against a palm tree in order to keep from being knocked flat into the street again. Mariana, he whispered to himself as images of the child flooded his memory. He was pushing her stroller down the street. He'd stepped into the bar to show Beatriz how big the girl was getting and accepted a beer on the house. But of course, it was never one beer, was it? And something had happened. Someone had beat the shit out of him over... what? Something he couldn't remember. But where was Mariana? Alberto felt the bile rise hot in the back of his throat as he allowed his eyes to scan the area where he'd just been lying, almost afraid of what he might find. But there was no stroller, no baby. Por favor, padre querido, he murmured the instant he caught a flash of pink several feet away. Please, dear father. He ignored the intense pain that came with each dread-filled step until he was looking down at the item. Alberto Ruiz dropped to his knees, clutching the single tiny pink sock to his chest as he looked upward, screaming his fear and his rage, shouting his pitiful pleas to the heavens. As usual, no reply came. He couldn't remember what he'd done, but whatever it was, it had cost him his baby.